I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Can you name 5 women artists? Most people can't, but museums around the world are working to change that. You can share your thoughts on why representation matters in a live YouTube chat or on Twitter. Female artists remain dramatically underrepresented and undervalued in the art industry. A new social media campaign supported by 1,500 museums around the world is drawing attention to the inequality by promoting the stories and work of female artists. Women make up half of all visual artists today, but only a fraction of their work is represented in major museum collections. Women of colour often fare even worse, and artwork by women sells for 40% less than the work of their male counterparts. Underrepresentation of women in art can translate into some very real-world consequences. The Guerrilla Girls, an anonymous group of artists who fight sexism and racism in the art world, explain why.
If art is a record of culture, and the art doesn't look like the culture, and the art is told only through the works of white males, that's basically what it is. It's the history of patriarchy, not the history of who we are.
I feel I need a little bit of explanation there why those two gorillas talking to you. The idea of the Guerrilla Girls is that it's not about the personalities, it's about the purpose and the movement. So it shouldn't be about one individual artist, it should be about changing the way that we think about women in art. Having said that, joining us in our studio to discuss women in art, Mertice Badola, the founding director of Gallery Mertice in Baltimore, Maryland. Also with us, Ida Malina, a contemporary artist and photographer. Ida is based in Ethiopia, but she joins us today from Ivory Coast. And finally, we have Chidria Lebouvier. She is the curator, and she was the curator of the acclaimed Basquiat exhibition at the Guggenheim, and she joins us from New York. Ladies, it's great to have you. This idea of challenging the public to name 5 women artists. Ida, what do you make of that?
I mean, I think it's a great challenge, and I can say honestly that a lot of the times what I have seen is that most people don't know these artists because it's not in their education system. So if we are to start at a foundation, it's, we have to look back at how we are educated, in early ages about art, and who is part of that conversation. So if you can imagine, being an African woman is even more challenging to be in the mainstream. And also the fact that there's barely any content. I know that when I went to school in Canada and also in the US, there's barely any content relating to women artists or even artists from the continent.
Shadria, is it something wrong with the education, the way that we're taught about art? Is that where we fail in terms of not being able to just reel off tons of women artists' names, know their work?
Well, I think that's the beginning of the failure in a sense. But I think that but there are also a lot of opportunities to self-educate. It's what you do as a curator or an art writer, and you have a responsibility to do that. And so I think, curatorially, it's very fascinating to me that when we talk about the absence of women, or the lack of visibility for women, that we don't talk about the fact that a lot of curatorial staff are women, and women aren't collecting each other, in those spaces. They're not exhibiting each other. They're not deciding to do scholarship on women artists. So so that to me is also a conversation about how women value each other in a way.
Is that, Mertice, is that institutionalizing sexism? How would you describe that? If so many women are in charge of curation in galleries and they're not putting women artists for the public to see, how do you explain what's going on there?
Well, I think, historically there has been a de facto system of discrimination in major institutions. When we look at the laws from the late 20th century that forbid institutions to
designate funds for the acquisition of Black art, and also to recognize and to exhibit artists of color. And so we still have a culture within many institutions that still adhere to that. They deemed the work of Black artists a poor derivative of European art. And so that culture still exists, and we're still combating that today.
I want to share with our audience who are watching Emma Fieler. Emma Fieler is from the National Museum of Women in the Arts, who started this Name 5 Women Artists campaign. She explains more here.
Since the start of the campaign, over 1,500 cultural institutions, museums, galleries all over the world have joined our call and participated using the hashtag 5WomenArtists. And, you know, historically, women have been underrepresented in gallery and museum exhibitions. And while there's been progress over the years, this inequity continues to this day. And the 5 Women Artists campaign is a means to challenge those organizations and cultural institutions to confront those inequities and create a future with gender parity in the arts.
I want to show you that piece of art. I know, a piece of art behind Emma. It's called Acid Rain from 2001. Let me just scroll down. Yeah, I want you to see it there. Let me just scroll down. This is the artist. Let me click on here. And you can see her there, Jakia Booker. So we were giving a bigger platform to women in art, but there's also a question about money. There's a gender pay gap, Ida. Have you experienced that? Tell me.
I mean, you know, anybody can look up this information online, but it's quite surprising that, you know, we're in a $200 billion industry, and as women, we only have 2% of that market. So there is a disparity within that. And unfortunately, you know, it's not only in the art world, but it's across the full board of, you know, different professions. But for me, one thing that I've noticed is that even the opportunities are quite limited. And you have to remember, I started as a photojournalist, which is a very male-dominated industry. And transitioning into the art world, I realized that it's also the same challenge that we face to sort of, you know, validate ourselves, and also to show that, you know, the work and the voice that we have is relevant within the art market.
Sidri, I saw you knowing. There was a knowing nod and a smile there, rueful smile about when I mentioned money. Let's go there. Tell us about the discrepancy.
Well, you know, it's like the chicken and the egg, and sort of the artists that I specialize in, Basquiat and Keith Haring, are, you know, emblematic of the market in explicit ways. And it's, you know, I tend to think of the money it's a multi-pronged issue, but it's sort of, from my vantage point as a curator, scholarship impacts and shows impact that. So if women are not getting shows and they're not getting criticality and this intellectual workout that bridges their work in a art historical way in the canon, or how they're contesting the canon, it does affect the value.
Yeah. It's SK, who knew we were doing this show on Twitter, says, diversity is the answer. The decision makers must be inclusive, curious and visionary, plus acquire a better understanding of your visitors and cater to all sections of society. Wow, this would be amazing. Mertice, is this possible?
Oh, it is possible, but there has to be a commitment. I mean, we have a movement, but once the month is over, the month of March, what commitment will those institutions make to acquire the works of those women? How many of the women of the 5 that they're asking people to nominate are actually in their permanent collections? So there has been this systemic problem of denying women access to institutions that truly impact their careers and the value of their work in the marketplace.
Let's just look at some figures, because sometimes the data, when you just look at the raw figures, that really is a wake-up call. So let's look at the difference between the most highest paid piece of art that was by a woman artist compared to a male artist. And then we've got them living and also ones who have passed, and you can see that big difference there. As we are sharing art with you, I want to actually share you that piece of art that Jenny Saville actually went for over 12 million, and it's this piece of art here, so that we actually then can put art to names. Where is the money in the art industry coming from, Mertiz?
Well, it comes from many sources. We have major collectors who will commit funds to buying. I mean, they really are the ones that influence the market and the direction in which it goes. I mean, now Black art is what's trendy. There's a realignment of art in terms of historical acquisitions, museums now committing themselves, having recognized that there is inequity in their collections, that they have failed to support the works of Black artists. And so, you know, Black art is now the trend.
Ida, are you feeling trendy?
I mean, this is always my concern when it comes to art from Africa, because all of a sudden, you know, we were like discovered, but we've been creating art for a long time. So for me, it's really, especially for the market coming out of the continent, you know, this is what concerns me, is that we have to develop our institutions. Imagine, you know, if you look at how many curators we have, how many art critics we have, how many publications do we have that is really addressing the art from the continent, you know, and there's always this thing of this fad and so forth. But I believe that, you know, for me personally, I want to exhibit, not because I'm African or Ethiopian or whatever, I want to exhibit merit and the strength of my work. That's my first priority. But at the same time also, you know, even when you go to Art Basel, you know, the representation is quite off, you know, even in the States it's quite off. So this is really something that has to be pushed forward. And I honestly think that, you know, generation of especially having online access and having social media and so forth, it has given Africa an opportunity to really push the forefront. That's why you see a lot of art coming out of the continent that, you know, people weren't aware of before. And all of a sudden collectors are bored with like European art or, I don't know, American art. So now they're focusing on the continent because they feel like that's the new it. But to me, we're here to stay. It's not just being the fad. We're still going to continue producing work regardless of what the market trend is. But the key thing to me is how do we educate our own people to also collect? Because there is money in Africa, but the governments don't support us. You know, the people who have money have no idea of what they're collecting. So there's a whole different process when you talk about representation, when you talk contemporary art.
That is a really good point. How do you educate people of color, people who are not necessarily collecting art, who don't think it's accessible to them, that they don't think it's part of their heritage to collect art and to invest in art? How do you do that?
Well, I think that's in part of the role of the curator. And Ida's points were so well taken. I mean, trends come and go. So how do we help our people understand the importance of preserving our culture? Committing money to supporting our artists so that it isn't all lost to people who are buying it as trophy pieces and really don't understand the cultural significance and importance of it.
Jazeera, I want you to humble brag a little bit. You have a number of firsts to your name, and one of those firsts I'm just going to pause on and tell a bit of a story. But tell our audience how many firsts you have in terms of things that you have done and achieved in your career. Go ahead, keep it short.
I think there are 4.
Okay, go for it.
I'm the first Black person to curate and helm a show at the Guggenheim. I'm the first Black woman, the first curator of Cuban descent, and the first Black author of a Guggenheim catalog in their 80-year history.
All right, so that sets up nicely something that we found on Twitter that pretty much went viral. So, here we go. It went down at the Guggenheim, and this is Jazeera here, the first Black curator to exhibit with the institution with her show, Basquiat, Defacement, The Untold Story. There was a panel.
Yes.
And you weren't on the panel. But you went to the panel anyway and did this. Okay, stand by.
And having spoken to many of you before the panel started, I just wanted to address the elephant in the room. I'm the curator of the Basquiat show that's upstairs, and 2 of the contributors to my catalog are on the stage. And the Black woman who's been hired as the first Black curator that the Guggenheim has hired full-time is on the stage as well. And so when we're talking about this dynamic.
All right, so this goes on for some time. I will share the link so that people can actually watch that. That was drama, that was epic. How is it possible that the curator of a collection was not on the panel? Why did that happen?
Oh, I think it's really simple. I think that's, a personification of the value system. I think it's not normal. It's why I think it did go viral because, the curator is considered the intellectual and sort of spiritual steward of a show. And in my case, there was no public programming for the show. So for the one institutional effort to intellectually contextualize the show, you leave off the person, the steward of that show. You're making a statement that you don't value diversity, you don't value Black curators and those efforts, or even what your history has meant. And a gesture like that is meant to say that you are not welcome in this space.
I hear your conversation. I hear the context within which you have this conversation, but there will be many people who disagree with you in terms of this is art, it should stand alone. So for that, I'm going to go to Laura Ingraham, who has a show on Fox News. And when she heard that there's a Baltimore museum that is only going to curate women's art, this was her reaction. Let's have a look.
Everyone's supposed to be just judged on their own merits, on their own value, make their own choices. And now you are actually having your worth determined by the sex that you were born with. How does that make any sense?
Well, the right thing to do is to let art stand on its own and let people judge what is worthy or not worthy for inclusion based on how it looks and what audience it can draw.
Matisse.
That just makes
It's a bit crazy.
Flesh crawl, yes, because it's wonderful to hear white people make that testimony, right? Someone who's never walked in Black skin. And wouldn't it be panacea if that were the way in which museums operated? But it clearly isn't. There has been racism and sexism in these institutions that have denied equality, equal access to them. And if we were included based on the merit of the work, on the cultural and historic importance of it, that conversation would not have taken place. But there is not equity. There has not been diversity. There has not been inclusion. And so for them to make those statements, I'm not surprised because I deal with people like that, people who think that way and believe that we are blind to their discriminatory practices, and somehow we're supposed to look to them, and whatever crumbs they throw to us, we should be very happy to receive. But we're talking about full equality, which we deserve, and they are still denying complete access to these institutions.
Well, I think Laura Ingram's statements are actually in some way quite refreshing in the sense that she's being very honest about about what she believes. And to the earlier point that I made, these are white women in these museums making these decisions. Like, of course, men sit at the power white men sit at the top of the pyramid scheme of power, right? But there are white women like Laura who basically say the same thing in different ways, but they say the same thing, which is why in 2020, we're still having these conversations with a visual dynamic of women chief curators or women deputy directors of museums or women or curatorial staffs that are 85% women, and women of color are the most underrepresented aspects of their permanent collection. It's because of statements, because there are a lot of white women in museums that believe that.
For me, you know, what is interesting is that she's an anchor woman who I'm sure in the history of news, she is standing on the shoulders of those before her who I believe had to fight through in news to get to that position. So it's kind of ironic to me that she's making that statement, because at the end, you know, regardless of your color, the challenge is intense. But as you know, to me, you know, sometimes I feel like it is women also that drag us down, you know what I mean? And this is why I feel that more women need to be supportive as well, and to understand, especially, I don't know, for me in my position as an artist, you know, there are many challenges that I have to encounter. But at the same time, what I see is that, you know, everybody needs to be educated. And especially when you look at the American market, which a lot of the times, and, you know, I hate to keep talking about Africa, but I always find that in the States, it's very clueless to what's happening in the continent, you know? So there are many layers to this, and there are these statements. And granted, yes, she's entitled to her opinion, but she has to remember also where she started and where she came from. And I'm sure she had challenges as a woman. So if she was an artist, she'd be facing, you know, the same challenges of, I'm sure, what she has encountered. So it's I don't know, this kind of information for me, it's always, especially in mass media, this is what takes us down, honestly.
Jazeera, I'm just looking at your curation here at the Guggenheim. So as you talk, can you educate us about artists that we should be looking into, that should be on our radar, that we can actually understand better as a public? So next year, when we're asked to give 5 women artist names, we can just reel them off with great ease because we've seen their work, we know their work.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I've been a fan of Ada's work since I saw her work in London in 2016 at the 154 Fair. And I follow her work, and she's absolutely an artist that the public should be following. Barbara Chase Rabu, who has done her body of work as a sculptress is absolutely amazing. Augusta Savage. There's Jordan Castile. There's who's doing amazing things. There's Cass Namada, who's a young emerging artist out of the continent of Africa. There's one of my favorites, Helen Frankenthaler. Let's see. I'm trying not to say like the typical usual. There's Nina Chanel Abney that's doing really great work. Elizabeth Axman.
So basically, we need to hang out with you, and then you can just curate our lives for us. Thank you, Matisse. You also made sure that on our panels that we have beautiful artwork. Do you want to take us through which artists that you brought in to show us?
Yes.
We'd love to know more.
So the photograph of the mother and the child, that is the work of Tawny Chapman, who has a solo exhibition now at Fotografiska in New York. Her work is centered around Black childhood and the celebration of the Black body. We have Monica Ikegju, Monica's work is, she paints a work around her contemporaries, her siblings. She deals a lot with fashion as part of their identity and individuality. We also have Lavette Ballard, whose commission piece of Rosa Parks is on Time magazine. She was one of the artists to create a work about women, celebrating women. And this piece here is She is Immortal, which is paying honor to Henrietta Lacks. And then we have Shanique Gay, whose work is very spiritual. She creates these amalgamated figures and who exist in a sort of spiritual world. And she deals with inequality and inequities as well.
Beautiful. You turned our studio into a gallery, and then just behind me here is Ida's work. So I'm surrounded by beautiful art. I want to leave you with one last comment, which is Shamini, who was at an art exhibition when she said this. Have a listen to her.
Women aren't featured, right? Like I was at the Hirshhorn recently, and they have the Manifesto art exhibit, and in that exhibit they had a series by the Guerrilla Girls, and this was a series that they did in 1989, right? And it had stats, and it was about how, you know, over 80% of women artists are in the vaults and the basements of our national galleries. That's why people can't name women artists, because they don't get the gallery space. They're not featured.
You just heard from 3 women who are getting those women out of the basement and into the galleries. Thank you to Matisse, Ida and Jazeera. We really appreciate you. Next time you're asked to ask 5 women artists, you'll be able to do it and then some. See you next time. Take care.